I'm taking on an impossible topic tonight, and I realized that while I was working on it, but I'll simply do my best to work through what is, I think, a very, very important issue as to what we do next. Like many of you, I've become increasingly alarmed by the apparent acceleration of climate change in the past few years. I think we're all aware of the indicators of this acceleration and also of the dire consequences for us in the future. But despite these indications, and despite the increasingly frantic warnings from climate scientists, governments have not really treated the climate crisis as a crisis. There hasn't been the kind of mobilization of resources and people that you would find in a real crisis, as for example, during the Second World War. So what do we do? The time we have for decisive action is really quite short. No one knows how short, but the Paris Agreement in 2015 set a lower and a higher goal for global warming, 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius as a lower and upper goals. It appears we've almost lost the first goal, and therefore we're fighting to keep within 2 degrees Celsius increase. To my mind, we are in the decisive decade of human history that if we haven't achieved a fairly significant turnaround within about 10 years, that is a significant movement towards a net zero economy, we are going to be in deep trouble, it seems to me, so that the time is short. But what to do about it? We need action, but what kind of action is going to be decisive in this context? My main point then is that the usual way of conceiving of alternatives as reformist versus radical leads to an impasse, and that a radical reformist alternative might be a way out of that impasse. So let me now then begin by looking at reformism in the form of green growth or green capitalism. I don't need to say very much about this because it, after all, is the dominant perspective of our societies. It is adhered to by most governments in the world, by international organizations, the World Bank, the OECD, by most corporations, and by most individuals in their role as consumers. So green growth is what we have, what we are trying to pursue. And of course, green growth has long roots, which I won't go into, and has an intellectual basis in neoclassical economics, and also more particularly in environmental economics, which is an offshoot of neoclassical economics. The bold claim made by green growth is that one can have perpetual growth and prosperity while safeguarding the ecological foundations of our world for future generations. That if you really boil it down, that is really what is being stated. And that can be achieved if you follow the right policies, which are mainly but not wholly market-oriented policies, and also continue to invest heavily in technological change, because this is a technological optimist of the world. Now, an interesting premise of the green growth is that it's a struggle to defeat climate change, but it's a struggle without really an enemy. There's not an enemy. The closest one can come to an enemy is if you think of the old Pogo, famous Pogo cartoon, when Pogo says, "I've seen the enemy and he is us." Well, this is more or less what green growth is suggesting, that we all are the enemy, in the fact that we make demands for consumption, and those demands are growing, and they lead to greater throughputs of energy and material, and therefore we have to cut down. We all are responsible. We're all in the same boat, in a sense. Now, I'll enter directly into a critique of green growth, because I think this is not a viable approach to the problem. And I'm summarizing in each of 3 points an enormous body of literature, which is not to say the debate is over in any sense, because it's not. But it's just to say that there's a lot of evidence behind the very brief critique that I can provide here this evening. The first problem with green growth relates to relative versus absolute decoupling of economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions. Now, relative decoupling is very common. That is to say, economic growth continues, but greenhouse gas emissions remain constant or increased, but less than the rate of growth, or may even fall somewhat. But absolute decoupling is rare. Absolute decoupling means that economic growth continues, but greenhouse gas emissions decline absolutely over time. Now, the absolute decoupling has occurred in around 20 countries, mainly in the European Union, North America, Japan, over a decade or two. And there is some question, of course, of whether that absolute decoupling is entirely genuine, or has it been that some very polluting industries have been exported to the global south, especially to East Asia, where these manufacturing goes on with products returning. So there is some displacement of emissions from, Northern Europe, let's say, which is a very service sector-based economy, to East Asia, with products coming back from there. But nonetheless, there is this absolute decoupling. But the problem is neither broad enough nor deep enough. It's not broad enough in the sense that it excludes India, Japan, and Brazil, who are now major producers of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not deep enough in the sense that the absolute decoupling, the absolute decline of greenhouse gases is not fast enough in the industrialized Western countries to actually keep us below 2 degrees of warming by after 2050. So there is a problem with the degree of decoupling that we have attained. And I'll come back to the response of green growth people to that critique in a few minutes. Second problem is that the current rate of consumption, the mining required to supply the minerals for the green energy transition, will be devastating in its own terms. That is to say that if we want to transfer from the fossil fuel based energy system to a green electrical energy at the current rate, this will mean an astronomical increase in mining in often very ecologically vulnerable areas, such as tundra and rainforests and deserts lacking water, and also seabed mining, which is on the agenda now. So lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, graphite, rare earths are all in fairly short supply given the enormous demand. And so therefore there's a real need for developing exponentially the number of mines. And many of those would be in the global south. But the trouble is that nearly all of these mining, all these mining activities are very devastating. I mean, lithium occurs in salt brine, requires a great deal of water to separate lithium, to get lithium out of that salt brine, whether it's in Chile or Bolivia or Argentina or Australia or China or Serbia or Portugal or North America. And so there's a problem of the devastating impact, but there's another aspect of this as well. And that was brought to my mind by attending a webinar recently by somebody who's following lithium mining on a global basis. And she says, as a rule of thumb, where lithium prospecting goes, there goes protest. So around the world, because of the rather devastating ecological consequences, there is increasing mobilization of social movements to prevent mining. And these stall, at the very least, they stall the mining, and they can sometimes stop it entirely. The result is, of course, that the cost of various essential minerals in the electrification process are going up. And recently the windmill, the last year, the companies producing electrical windmills are suffering very badly from lack of profits as a result of the increase in the price of minerals. So we don't want to save the world in one way, that is to deal with the climate problem, by destroying it in another, that is by mining in sensitive areas in a highly devastating manner, especially when many of those mines are in countries in which the people have done very little to contribute to global warming. Well, there's more I could say about that, including the fact that, think about the tens of thousands of square kilometers of land and ocean that would need to be set aside for solar panel farms and wind farms in order to actually provide the energy for our level of consumption now. That alone would be ecologically damaging as well, those tens of thousands of acres set aside at manner. So it's really quite a severe problem. Now, the third critique of green growth I have is really a skepticism about technological optimism. Within this context, there is a faith in technology. That is that human ingenuity can deal with any problems created by markets. And therefore, if there are not solutions now, there will be in time. But can we actually gamble on that? It seemed like a very poor gamble. If you just think about the technologies that are currently being touted as ones to deal with the climate crisis. And I'll mention them without going into detail, but carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, green hydrogen, nuclear fusion. What else have I forgotten here? Small modular reactors, nuclear energy itself. Now, nuclear energy is sometimes touted as a green source, but in fact, it only provides about 6% of the world's energy now. It takes a long time to build the facilities. They're very expensive, and there are the dangers involved. So we really can't rely on nuclear technology. I'm not saying that we should be ruled out, but it's not a reliable alternative on a large scale at this stage. So my conclusion is that green growth, as we now know it, is actually a very bad bet for us. It's not going to probably get us to where we want to be, which is to keep the global warming below 2 degrees centigrade. So that's part of the impasse then, that what is possible seems to be inadequate to the problem. The other alternative that I mentioned, the radical alternative, is seeking to displace capitalism, because capitalism is seen as inherently growth-oriented, which is deleterious for ecological sustainability. I should say right off the bat that degrowth is the most dominant strain of thinking in this radical perspective, but degrowth itself is diverse. So I don't want to mislead you into thinking there's just one kind of degrowth. There are, in fact, a number of overlapping concepts which are rather confusing. So I'll try and unravel some of these terms for you. First of all eco-socialists are degrowthers, as far as I can determine, but not all degrowthers are eco-socialists, although many are. So there are some degrowthers who are not eco-socialists. Well, why don't degrowthers simply talk about post-growth, since that seems a more positive kind of way of framing it? Degrowth is a very hard term. Well, one reason is that post-growth has already been used by those analysts who believe that you can make change within capitalism to deal with climate change. And degrowth in its the radical version, which is the dominant one as far as I can make out, does not accept that possibility. So they're a bit leery about post-growth. They instead prefer to talk about post-capitalism as where we should be headed. This concept allows them to not talk about being socialists, which obviously socialism now carries such ideological baggage that if you're weighed down with that, you're fighting battles that you don't want to fight. But of course, it cannot be avoided with right-wing populists and conservatives ready to jump the slightest provocation. They will end up being, if they are at all powerful, being termed socialists. Now, degrowth as the most important part of this intellectual movement on the radical end began in the early 2000s in France, in French universities, I should say, and spread from there to Europe, and then later to North America and the rest of the world. So it is today an intellectual movement. I use the word intellectual quite important, because the universities were the source of ideas for degrowth quite heavily. And that has left this imprint, in my view, on degrowth literature. There are dozens and dozens of books written on it, hundreds of articles, and I can't say that I've read more than a fraction of all that work, but I will say that reading degrowth material is hard going. If you've done it, you'll know. It's a lot of abstraction, and I feel that I, as an academic, can ride with that because I'm used to it. But I'm wondering who the audience of many of these books is, because I don't think many, people outside the university would really have the patience to work with such levels of abstraction as you find in the degrowth literature, unfortunately. There are many, many good ideas there. There are many brilliant people, but it's shaped by the necessities of the university. If you're a professor or an academic, you have to publish, and to get promotions and to get tenure and promotions, wage increases, you need to have published in certain journals. If you want to publish in certain journals, you have to write a certain way with a certain level of abstraction, and then there you've got it. Degrowth being not able to communicate very much with ordinary people. So in climate marches, you often do see the simplified banner. What does it say now? System change, not climate change, which I've always found rather bewildering myself, but this is kind of a crystallization of these complex ideas into a slogan. So we're talking very much about intellectual movement of some import and some intensity with all around the world, with conferences and meetings, and with some influence on popular understandings via these slogans and so on. Because the main idea, if I may state it, of degrowth is an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions at the national and global levels, with degrowth starting in the advanced industrial countries. So they talk often about good life for all within planetary boundaries. So just to give you an idea for those of you who are not familiar with this literature, what you find in degrowth literature is, first of all, a critique of capitalism, a critique which suggests that the logic of capitalism is grow or die, basically, to really get to the essentials of it. The idea is grow or die. And so there's a whole critique of capitalism as being tied to growth of material, of throughputs, of energy and natural resources, and that therefore capitalism is going to end by devastating the world. There's a second part of the literature which is to do with a vision of the future, which is a very attractive vision, obviously. It's a sustainable world, convivial, democratic, egalitarian, what one would expect in terms of a world we'd all like to live in, actually, or nearly all of us, except those, I guess, who are billionaires who might not find the conviviality to their taste. And the third part of the literature is to do with policy. There are many complex ideas of policy bundles to actually get to degrowth, and along with that is what I regard as an underdeveloped theory of political strategy, of how you get from where we are now to there. But I think it's really underdeveloped. So moving to critique of this this approach, this intellectual movement, well, the critique is really summed up of the quandary of the degrowthers is summed up by a slogan which was painted on the walls of Paris in 1968, which one I've always actually cherished. I find that wonderful French irony came to in so few words. In French, well, in English, it was, "Be realistic, demand the impossible." Be realistic, demand the impossible. So be realistic. Well, degrowth is realistic in realizing that we can't go on the way we are. We need about 2 Earths to continue with our level of consumption without leading to ecological degradation. But demand the impossible. That's the problem. There's the rub. If to end growth, you need to end capitalism, and all that has to happen within a very short period of 10 to 20 years, there is a real problem here. And as one well-noted Marxist said, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It's an oft-quoted slogan on the left, and it has a lot of truth to it. Easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The first political problem is who will vote for degrowth, except you and me, of course. But aside from that, I mean, where are the votes going for such a hard term? Where is the mass movement? Where is the kind of writings that can attract beyond academia, beyond the graduate students and undergraduates in the social sciences? How will they deal with right-wing populists who are now in the ascendancy and are attacking where they can? The degrowthers will be just lambs to the slaughter with right-wing populists because they can so easily be classified as socialists and with all the baggage that carries for some people. Fourthly, degrowth in one country is virtually impossible. Just imagine what would happen. A government is about to assume power that has degrowth as part of its program. Well, we know what'll happen. The currency, there'll be capital flight and capital strike. The national currency will fall. Inflation will rise. Unemployment will rise. It'll create an economic crisis, which becomes a political crisis, and then the overthrow of the government advocating degrowth. So degrowth in one country just doesn't work. So how can it be coordinated? It seems very difficult. So these are just some of the reasons that I'm skeptical of degrowth. And the second part of the impasse then is that what is desirable and necessary, degrowth is improbable in the short time available to us. Well, is there a way out of this impasse? Well, I've suggested that perhaps there is a way out in the form of radical reformism. The dichotomous categorization is absolutely too crude, and we need to go beyond that to consider radical reformism. What radical reformism implicitly argues is that you can transform, there can be a transformation within capitalism to a sustainable form of production, which is often now called the Green New Deal. So I'm going to develop that notion further here. First of all, I have to make clear that we all understand that there's a diversity of Green New Deals, and not just one. There are 3 variants of the Green New Deal. And one is kind of a progressive form of green growth. This is Jeremy Rivkin's book on the Green New Deal. It basically green growth, but with a progressive edge to it. On the other hand, there are other green growth, Green New Deals, which are very close to degrowth in requiring almost a transformation of capitalism. So what I'm referring to is the sort of in-between radical view of the Green New Deal, which is implicitly then, as I've mentioned, a transformation within capitalism to a form that is sustainable, which means, of course, the overthrowing of neoliberalism and taking direct aim at the fossil fuel industry and its supporters. Now, interestingly, and I think very importantly, those who have propounded the Green New Deal tend to be activists and politicians, not academics. You can almost see the difference in the main term, Green New Deal as opposed to degrowth. I mean, Green New Deal is a soft term. It has all connotations of FDR's New Deal of the 1930s, which was very well renowned and egalitarian and quite successful. So the originators of the term, and I might say that the heyday of the Green New Deal was between 2018 and 2021. And they include people like Avi Lewis in Canada, who was one of the main people who pushed for the LEAP manifesto in 2016. Naomi Klein, Noam Chomsky, Andrew Pollan, a dissident economist, Kate Aronoff, and in the political realm, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey with their 2019 congressional resolution on the Green New Deal, which of course didn't pass. And not to mention Bernie Sanders with his 2020 primary contest in which the Green New Deal was part of his program. So we're dealing mainly with politicians and activists who've already who know how to make compromises, who have made compromises, who have thought about how to appeal to a larger audience. So it's much more user-friendly than degrowth or eco-socialism for that matter. In fact, Canada's LEAP manifesto of 2016 covers most of the main points of this radical Green New Deal I'm talking about. Had 5 points: 100% renewable energy by 2050, protection of workers who were displaced in the fossil fuel sector or any other sectors, protection of their pensions as well as retraining and new jobs for those people, recognition of Indigenous land rights, the building of an egalitarian society, which is a part of all attempts of a radical nature to deal with the climate crisis. You simply cannot divorce social inequality from the climate crisis, partly because those who are very wealthy disproportionately generate the greenhouse gases. 1% of the world's wealthiest people generate 15% of its carbon dioxide, according to the report to the Club of Rome 2022 called Earth for All. And the bottom 50% of people in the world provide maybe 20% of global emissions. So equality is very much linked, as well as the fact that economic power generates political power. And therefore, in order to counteract neoliberalism, you have to counteract the enormous disproportionate, the enormous wealth of a few individuals in our society, because that wealth generates political power and the ability to very much shape events politically, even in liberal democracies. So the fifth and final element of this LEAP manifesto refers to the formation of a powerful grassroots movement. Well, that's obvious that the political action is needed to attain such a radical program. And so there's a heavy emphasis placed on building coalitions. And actually, the LEAP manifesto itself was a result of a group of people who came from trade unions, from indigenous peoples organizations, from environmental organizations, and other social justice movements come together to try and work out a common program. So it's based on that kind of compromise. But what I would suggest is that the Green New Deal, as I briefly described it, is not in itself sufficient, because there really is a problem with growth. There is a problem, no matter whether, even if you manage to change the energy system from fossil fuels to clean electricity, even then there would be a real problem with our level of consumption. So there needs to, as well, to be a supplement. You need to supplement the Green New Deal with the idea of placing constraints on throughputs in the manufacturing process, on natural resources, and on energy, regardless of whether it's green or fossil fuel, and also, of course, on the wastes that are generated and for various sinks in nature. Now, before I go into more detail what I mean by that, I would simply answer the implicit question. I mean, is this politically possible? And of course, I don't know the answer to that, but I would say that it is much more politically feasible than the degrowth platform. It is more feasible because, for one thing, it is not anti-capitalist necessarily. It is not anti-capitalist. It is anti-neoliberal and anti-fossil fuels and pro-egalitarian measures, but it is not an attack on private property. Granted, there would inevitably be public ownership of some parts of the economy, such as the fossil fuel corporations. You can imagine them being bought up by the state when the share prices of the fossil fuel corporations collapse, when caps are placed on the actual production of oil, gas, and coal. But with private property not at stake in this scenario, it is quite conceivable that elements of the business class will in fact agree or be part of the coalition. All those interests that are now developing, all those companies around the green economy, for example, will be sympathetic to the Green New Deal, which of course, because it has a very large element of government generated funding, is going to lead to a bonanza for companies in that sort of, in that part of the economy. So, of course, even so, the Green New Deal, as I've described it in such general terms, could only be possible if there was a left of center coalition to support it. In my view, the climate change has really become really now belongs to the left, because the conservatives and the further far-right groups, populists, have increasingly become skeptical about climate change. It means that what we're dealing with when we're talking about climate, a coalition, is basically left of center. But by that I mean in Canada, that it includes many of those who vote for the Liberal Party, which is hardly a radical group. It includes me quite often, and it's hardly a radical group. And probably all of those, I hope, who vote NP, Green Party, or Bloc Québécois, and even beyond that for people who don't vote but are on the left. So there is a substantial coalition that might be generated for such an approach. But is the Green New Deal, as I've described it, viable? Because there's a very strong opinion on the left that capitalism is inherently growth-oriented, that the logic of capitalism is grow or die. If they are right, then this Green New Deal is simply a fantasy. It could never work within capitalism. Well, what I would say is that this common view on the left, that the logic of capitalism is grow or die, is really only an assumption. It is not a verified proposition. It is not even a verifiable proposition. It is a deeply held assumption about how the world works. And I think that assumption is actually incorrect. I think that what really blocks progress in resolving the climate crisis is not some abstract logic of capitalism, but is the power of capital and capital supporters to actually torpedo any kinds of policy initiatives which they see as contrary to their own interests. So we're talking about the political power of a group rather than some abstract logic that keeps us from developing a kind of economy and society in which we could live in harmony with the climate, but also with the ecology in general. For me, there are three reasons for believing that capitalism can indeed have a Green New Deal, which is ecologically sustainable. The first one is a proven adaptability of capitalism. Capitalism is really a vague concept. It's one of those sprawling concepts that begins being clear, but soon gets lost in the fact that nearly all countries of the world are regarded as capitalist when they differ so markedly among themselves. So we've lost track almost of what capitalism is. But in general, whatever capitalism is, it has shown itself to be highly adaptable to constraints. I mean, who in the early 20th century would ever have thought that a social democratic welfare state was possible? And yet it developed, first of all, in Sweden in the 1930s, and then elsewhere during the war and thereafter in the 1950s and 60s. The social democratic welfare state imposed limits on all the factors of production, on labor, land, and capital, on money. Money could not move where it wanted. You couldn't just fire workers. There are all kinds of constraints placed on capitalist firms by this, what became known as the Keynesian consensus that lasted until the late 1970s. So capitalism was highly adaptable and remains so. That is a good thing. Secondly, we have the idea of Herman Daly. Now, Herman Daly is a very important economist who wrote about the steady state economy from the late 1970s into the 2000s. And he's one of the founders of ecological economics and a highly renowned individual. And I think what he said and what others have said is very true. He said, if you create an economy by setting rules which allow corporations to exploit nature, then they will exploit nature, because those corporations that have scruples will be undercut by those who don't, and therefore nature will be degraded. However, if you reset the rules of an economy which made the exploitation of nature highly expensive or impossible, then there would be adaptation to these rules by many of the actors to it. I think there's a great deal to this thought, to this idea that the economy operates according to certain institutions. They're not immutable. They were created by people. They can be recreated, but it'd be very difficult to do so because those rules are in the interests of the most powerful segments of our society. So of course they don't want to see the rules changed. So that's the second thought about capitalism. Herman Daly believed that capitalism was indeed compatible with ecological sustainability. Now, the third reason for thinking that the Green New Deal would be viable is that the logic of capitalism is not grow or die, but profit or die. And growth and profits are not the same thing. In other words, you can have profits continuing when growth is limited. That is the important point that we need to bear in mind. For example, if there were constraints on throughputs of energy and natural resources, which I'll discuss if I have time in a few minutes in greater detail, there would still be competition among firms on the basis of efficiency. Those firms that are more efficient in the use of natural resources will undercut the price and therefore win out in the competition. There's also still competition over the quality of goods, and those providing higher quality will again win out in the competitive struggle. Within this kind of system, which is constrained, which constrains throughputs, therefore, innovation and entrepreneurship are still very much in demand to make best advantage of limited resources and energy. Profits can be made, and as a result of higher productivity, workers can also can share in those productivity gains. Plus, there can also be a number of other measures, such as job guarantees, job sharing, and limiting the hours of work of workers that will match the employment force to the actual economy in the Green New Deal. Of course, there are economic problems as well as political problems with this approach, and one would be debt. They're dealing with a debt problem of corporations and countries, but the massive public investment that it would require would at least to some extent be able to allow companies to deal with their debt problems. But some companies would indeed disappear, as would in time all the fossil fuel corporations that don't make the transition to green energy. But that would be a major fight. So I'm suggesting that neoliberalism and power structures are the problem, not any kind of innate logic of capitalism. And of course, neoliberalism is another very complex concept, which I can't go into really here. I only have 10 minutes remaining. There'll be many books written on them. In fact, I wrote one myself in 2014, which relates to neoliberalism. But we know that neoliberalism replaced the Keynesian consensus in the late 1970s, early 1980s. It harks back to the earlier economic liberalism of the 19th century. It aimed to reignite economic growth via liberalization of the factors of production, land, labor, and capital. But also now we have to add knowledge in the form of intellectual property rights as a fourth factor of production. So neoliberalism began as this winner-take-all form in the early 1980s with the cutbacks in the welfare state and in the trade union rights in so many countries, but has since then had to give in to some extent to pressures to bring the state back in with some degree of regulation. But in any event, neoliberalism has created problems it cannot resolve. And one of the biggest and most important problems it's created is, of course, the climate change, the climate crisis, and the ecological crisis more generally. So radical reformism, in short, attempts to make reforms within capitalism that cumulatively lead to structural change, to a Green New Deal plus, the plus being constraints on throughputs of energy and resources. So the Green New Deal does hark back to the Rooseveltian Green New Deal. It does involve a directive state, but not necessarily a highly centralized state. There's certainly room for decentralization to the municipal level for many aspects of the regulation of the economy. Let me say a few words about the program of the Green New Deal before I sign off in 7 minutes. I have my phone right here. My clock right here in front of me, so I'm keeping close tabs on it. There are 4 sets of policies that are essential to the Green New Deal as I described it. The first is massive, mainly public, green investment, so that initially there will not be a decline in economic growth. There will in fact be a spur to growth in order to provide the whole infrastructure of a green economy. And there will be retrofitting of buildings, the building of an excellent public transportation system, because we can no longer have large cars driving around using enormous batteries under the kind of conditions of constraint that we'll have to operate under. There'll be a change in the manufacturing sector because there has to be increasingly efficient and green processes of making steel and other important elements. And the universal public services will have to be developed because equality is such a major part of the overall program. So how would this be financed, you ask? Well, first of all, by removal of all subsidies on fossil fuels. I was frankly amazed to read an IMF report that suggested that said that in 2022, direct subsidies to fossil fuel companies on a global basis equaled $1.3 trillion. 1.3 trillion. They then go on to indirect or implicit subsidies, which are much higher, go up to $7 trillion per year. But $1.3 trillion. So in a country like the United States, there are hundreds of billions of dollars to be redirected from subsidies to fossil fuel companies. So that's part of it. The other part is that we would have to redirect billions from defense budgets. It could be hundreds of billions in the case of the US under any reasonable program, but billions in the case of other countries. And of course, there would be higher taxes on the wealthy, a wealth tax as well as higher income tax and inheritance taxes, because we can't have that kind of inequality that we have now to have a green economy operate, to work. The power of such wealthy people is too high. Their carbon footprint is too large for that to continue. Of course, we hope that there will be a lot of private investment as well that will be channeled into the green economy, not just public investment. That is one whole area then. The second would be constraints on throughputs would be an important thing. And one of the first things here would be to keep fossil fuels in the ground, because we have a situation where the fossil fuel corporations have been aware for decades of the greenhouse effect. ExxonMobil and Shell since the late 1970s, early 1980s, have understood entirely from internal research how the greenhouse effect works. But nonetheless, they are determined to extract and burn every molecule of oil and gas they have in their reserves, which would lead to our demise, basically, of Earth as we know it. We couldn't stand that level of greenhouse gas emissions. So there would have to be some way of keeping putting caps on fossil fuels. As well, there's a very, very interesting idea put forth in the report to the Club of Rome, Earth for All in 2022. Now, this report was a report of a whole dozens of eminent scientists and economists who got together to write and elaborate this report. And one of their central suggestions is a citizens fund with a universal basic dividend. And I ask you to actually look at that report to get the details of it. But the essence of it is that we should regard nature and public data on the internet as being part of the commons that belongs to all of us. And that any corporation that wants to use either the data or nature has to pay a levy to do so, a levy which is eventually returned to individuals on an individual basis as a dividend, a universal basic dividend. So the point here is that the commons have been enclosed by private interests. Our public data, nature, the use of the atmosphere and water as sinks for pollution is a privatization enclosure of the commons by private interests, and that we should reverse that privatization. A third element of the Green New Deal would be a just transition. And there are a whole range of proposals here to safeguard the positions of all those who have lost out in the fossil fuel industries, to ensure their jobs and pensions are, they have jobs and pensions to go to, and dealing with inequality in various aspects, which, as I mentioned, is essential to the whole program of climate crisis. And the fourth set of policies refers to international solidarity and transfers of technology and funding from the global north to the global south. Now, this is a major topic in itself, so I can't go into that, but obviously it's a very important item. So in conclusion, I hope I've been, in this very short space of time, been able to make a case that that change within capitalism is feasible and politically maybe possible, and that it should take place, first of all, in the liberal democracies of the West and Japan. The wealthy countries with democracy are more likely to be able to bring about a Green New Deal, and obviously authoritarian regimes, especially if those authoritarian regimes are petrostates. Petrostates will be the hardest nut to crack, obviously. They're not at all going to be sympathetic to the Green New Deal, so that'd be a major geopolitical issue there. But the hope would be that if a number of liberal democracies evolve towards a Green New Deal plus constraints, that they could form a club, a pretty powerful club, to bring about changes in the international rules of the game to try and generalize this concept to the global north as well. But the final thought I just like to leave you with is that the climate crisis is primarily a political problem. We have all kinds of technical solutions to the problem of climate change. We have lots of technical solutions. We know what to do. We know what we could do. We don't do it. And so it's the politics that really matter here. And that is a hard part, to bring together groups, especially on the left, because the left, unlike the right, is very fractious. I mean, look at the right wing in the United States. In Congress, everyone just falls into place. When Trump says a word, they change their vote. They're for, aiding Ukraine. Then they're not, because Trump changes his mind on that. So the right is able to have this kind of develop this kind of unity, but the left is very difficult. We have enormous trouble of cooperating, probably because we're too hung up on concepts of purity and our own idea of how things work. But in any event, the problem is nonetheless a political one, and the challenge for us is, can we make history? Put it very bluntly, can we make history? The stakes are very high. Thank you.